Well, company earnings out today. Quite a few companies this morning we talked about. Adcorp a little bit later in the day. They are an employment firm spoken of in a nasty way by certain parties as labour brokers. They reported a 13% rise in headline earnings per share to 236 cents. Revenue for the year was up by 34% to 8.6 billion. Final dividend 80 cents per share. CEO Richard Pike is with us. Richard, good evening to you. You did say in your commentary that you mentioned three things. You say there was performance, there was a strategic element, and there was an acquisitive element. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think let's talk about performance first off. We've had a great year. If you look at our organic trajectory in our blue-collar business and our white-collar business, which is really the engine room of the group, organically we grew by 29% in the blue-collar space, and we grew by 22% in the white-collar space at an EBITDA level. And I think that's very encouraging. We've worked hard, we've pushed hard, and so I'm very proud of what the team's brought home. But I think a lot of that has to do with the second element, which is the strategy. We've seen quite a lot.
It sounds like you've now got a strategy that you didn't have before. Now, obviously, that's not the case. But why that emphasis now?
It's a strategy we've probably built for the last 2 to 3 years. We've seen certain trends happening in this industry globally. We've seen that they would come to this particular market here, and particularly around the sophistication of the procurement of skills. You know, historically, it's been pretty slapdash, haphazard. It's been decentralized in organizations. HR takes some responsibility, line take another responsibility. And what you're finding is that the cost of employment is so big that companies have put a real emphasis on it, to the extent that they've put procurement in charge of it. Procurement departments get involved. They put out tenders. When tenders come out, they require certain things. They require competency, reputation, innovation, black economic empowerment credentials, financial stability, etc. So we've put a whole lot of emphasis on strategically how do we position ourselves for that, because there's also been the adoption of technology by procurement departments around that, using technology to make sure it's a level playing field as far as the agencies are concerned that sell into those organizations.
All right, let me pause there. We'll get on to the acquisitive side in a moment, Mohammed.
Yeah, I mean, something that's a burning question for me is naturally, as we stand today, we've got this very antagonistic relationship between labour, private sector, government. There was also an interesting report put out by Adcorp in terms of the decreasing influence of the trade unions in terms of union membership.
Yeah.
How does all of that feed through in terms of the prospects for your business?
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, ironically, the more uncertainty, the more complexity, the more threat of labour legislation, the more strikes, the more wage demands. That does play into our hands from the point of view that there's a preference for contract workers in preference to permanence, and also it becomes so complex for organisations they'd rather outsource it. So give it to someone like Adcorp, they can deal with all the complexity that comes with that. So that definitely plays into our hands. But it's not a healthy environment, as you mentioned, Mohammed. I think the robustness of the social dialogue in South Africa, it's not great from the point of view that you've got business, labour and government, and two of the parties are in a political alliance. So there's a compromise in terms of that social dialogue from the point of view that typically you would want government to be honest broker, but they can't be when they're a political alliance. So, you know, how we get through that impasse, and it's a little bit unfair to say Labour is in a political alliance, because it's COSATU is in a political alliance, not all the unions. But the other trend that you touched on is you're seeing quite a proliferation of small unions that are taking market share from the bigger guys, the traditional NUMs, for example. And they tend to busy themselves with working conditions, wages, the kind of things that a worker would be particularly interested in, and not playing politics and getting involved on a greater stage. So I think that's got to play itself out as well. But definitely there's a lot of tension between the unions, and how they fight for market share is by being more militant, which is not great in the workplace.
Richard, you showed strong revenue growth for the period. And you're given the state of the job market, etc. What is your market share currently in that labour market?
Just to throw some stats at you, there are about 3.9 million contract workers in South Africa, of whom about 900,000 would be placed by people like ourselves, labour brokers, and we have about 90 to 95,000 on assignment on any day. So we're on about 10% market share. We think that there's an opportunity to gain more of the 900,000, but also the 3 million that are disintermediated. From the point of view, as I mentioned earlier, the more complexity there is, the more people outsource that. So it's interesting, we've had really good growth, as you mentioned. It's been fantastic, and we think there are tailwinds and a lot of runway ahead of us. It's not because it's an exciting labour market or an exciting economy. It's the fact that we can position quite uniquely and take market share in that space.
Look, I haven't been through the detail of your numbers, but I mean, your HEPS at 13%, but revenue growth above 30. What was the drag on earnings?
It's not a drag. There's acquisitive growth
which we never got to get to it
we
quickly.
haven't got to, right. We bought a business called Paracon, which was a listed company, the biggest IT contracting business, which has just come into our numbers for the full 12-month period in the first place, and we issued equity for that. So so if you look at organically, as I mentioned, we grew probably somewhere around about 20%, just north of 20%. On the tax line, though, we paid more tax because we gave less learnerships, which you get tax deductions for, and that's really through sort of administrative deficiencies in the CETA system.